You're listening to the DFO Rundown podcast with Frank Saravalli and Jason Gregor on dailyfaceoff.com.
Welcome to episode 20 of the DFO Rundown. I'm Jason Gregor. Frank Saravalli has the day off today. He will join us next week. We are a very special guest because we did a lot of trade deadline talk earlier. And of course, with the trade deadline comes draft picks. There's only one GM who got a first rounder, and he ended up getting two, Jarmo Kekalainen. So we're going to talk about the draft. It's been a very odd year for amateur hockey. And some teams, some leagues have played more games. Some teams, some leagues have barely played any. So how will this impact scouting? Chris Peters, of course, formerly of ESPN and CBS, longtime draft analyst. He's going to join us to get us a rundown. And is there an advantage for like the USHL, for instance? A lot of those teams have played almost a regular season. So we'll get into that. Of course, the playoff push is on. Starting to see a little bit of separation. There's still some races for fourth place in each division. Of course, St. Louis, Arizona, and San Jose kind of holding on by their fingernails in the West. In the North, the Calgary Flames tonight, if they beat the Montreal Canadiens, they're suddenly two back. The Habs would have 3 games in hand, but could they come back and make the playoffs? We'll discuss that a little bit later on. In the Central, the Nashville Predators starting to slowly separate themselves from the Chicago Blackhawks. Dallas still hanging around. Not sure they'll have enough. They still got a tough sked, lots of games in a short period of time. And in the East, man, all those teams loaded up. The Islanders, the Capitals, the Penguins, and of course the Boston Bruins. Taylor Hall scoring his first goal for the Bruins last night in a victory for them. The Rangers have gotten hot, but is it going to be too little too late for NYR? Well, we'll look into all of that a bit later on today. But today's more focus is going to be about the draft. I know it's the middle of April. Usually we would be having the draft lottery this weekend. But due to COVID, everything has changed a little bit. But that doesn't change the preparation and the viewings or lack thereof by scouts. So we're going to get into that right away with Chris Peters. All right, let's get to our big guest this week, brought to you by jockmkt.com. It is a hybrid between fantasy sports and the stock market. You can trade shares of players in real time with other users. Prices are driven by user trader activity. And if you just want to try it out, it's very simple. Use the promo code DFO20 and you get a $20 deposit. Okay, check it out, jockmkt.com. And our guest today, a guy who perfect to have on as we want to talk about the upcoming NHL Draft. Many of you have heard him and read him at ESPN, USA Hockey, also at CBS. But now, like a lot of guys, he's ventured out on his own. You can check him out, HockeySense on Substack. Chris Peters, welcome to the DFO Rundown. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Jason. Thanks a lot for having me.
Hey, I appreciate it. It's it's a unique year. Now you live in, I'm going to call it USHL country.
Sure.
And the USHL is one of the leagues that has gotten to play, pretty close to a full schedule. As a scout, like I know you started getting into rinks early in 2021, the numbers were surging, so you weren't going to rinks earlier. But as a guy who's now entering his second decade of scouting, you used a lot of video. How different is video compared to live viewings for a scout?
Oh, well, I started on video when I was just kind of getting going as an independent blogger, really. And so I felt pretty good about it going back to it. But then all of a sudden I realized how much I miss seeing games live. And there's a lot of context in games. There's a lot of, things behind the play. Certainly you're at the mercy of camera angles, decisions by the director to make certain cuts to different areas of the rink. So, you can lose little pieces. You can still get a really good sense. I think it becomes more difficult when you're trying to really evaluate the mechanics of skating, when you're trying to look at just kind of the pre-play movements of a player, before they're really engaged in a play. What are they doing before that? It's hard to see that on video. So, and the other thing that's nice about, being at live games is there's always more things that you will catch when you're not focused on when you're the player that you're watching is not on the ice, or when there are other things like, especially now with video, you can chop up games so easily with just watching shift by shift, where you start losing some of that little those extra guys that you find that you like. So you really end up having to watch a lot more video and a lot more specific video. But yeah, I say in general, I think everyone would prefer live viewings. There's just a lot more to it. You can get by with video just fine. And I think that if you know how to watch video and if you're practicing it, you can be all right. But I know that for a lot of veteran scouts, this transition has been difficult. And it's not one that they enjoy. They certainly miss the rinks. And I think that, they feel like there's things that they're missing when they're not at a game.
Now, you, of course, you interact with a lot of the NHL scouts, and, scouts, it's unique. I've had scouts, when I run into a rink, ask me my opinion on a guy, and I kind of chuckle. I'm like, dude, this is like my second time seeing him. But you're always looking just at times to see what other people see. When you're compiling your own list, how do you ensure that, you don't have the outside noise, that it's going to be your own opinion? Because it's hard not to get influenced by what others say to you sometimes.
Yeah, I don't tend to start asking the questions about, how you feel about a certain guy until I have basically formulated my own opinion and I feel very strongly about it. And I think that it's always interesting to me. I haven't had many instances where I'll have a conversation with a scout and it changes my view, but sometimes somebody will say something that I hadn't thought of before, which I always appreciate, because there's so much that, I don't know that others do. And then there's, the outside context, background information. I tend not to talk to a player's coach a ton about them until very late in the process. Usually towards when I was at ESPN, I really wouldn't even make those contacts until closer to the combine. And so I basically want to have a really good sense of how I feel about a player before I do anything that, would kind of take my opinion and move it. So for instance, that, I just put out my spring draft rankings, and now that they're out, I will start asking more scouts, hey, what did you think? If they read it, what do you think about how I am on this? Because I want to know after the fact. I don't want to, it's just a good practice to see what they think and what they've seen, because some of those guys might have seen a guy live 4 times that I only saw live once, or didn't see live at all. And I value their opinions. And I think you also have to kind of keep a tight group of people that you trust and people that you can have open conversations with that are more, free flowing and in depth, but not one where, they understand that what they're telling me isn't going into my work. It's more what I'm telling them is, I never think as the writer that, whatever I say is going to impact what they do, but I do know that they read what we do, and they're always interested to see what the public perception is of players. And that's kind of what, people like myself do. So, yeah, but I think that I've been very, especially later in my career, I've been very cognizant of saying, this has to be me. This has to be what I think, because that's what I'm getting paid to do, or what people subscribe for. And I feel that comfortable enough in the experience that I have. But then again, you go back and you say, okay, now we review and I learn from whatever I hear, and that sometimes that'll show up in the final ranking. Sometimes it won't. But I think it's always valuable to get that information after you feel like you've made a very sound judgment on your own.
When you look at Chris Peters circa 2011 till Chris Peters a decade later, how better are you as a scout? What do you see now that you didn't see before?
I think there's just one thing. I've watched so much more NHL. I've always been an NHL fan, but I watch so much more NHL now for the purposes of watching what I need to see from players. And that has greatly improved my ability to not get so in love with one particular trait. I think about early in my career, I was obsessed with skill. And I still am. I still want players that are skilled. I still want to see players that have a special ability. But I'm starting to, you have to be able to see the warts in those players as well, when, sometimes they are a very skilled player that there's other elements of their game, like their skating or their hockey sense or other things where, maybe they're not deploying the skills appropriately. And I think that, as we've kind of moved into an age where we're more analytics driven, and I've become much more in tune with historical context for performances. It's something I look at very closely, much more closely than I did. And I think one of the players that helped me learn that lesson was Alexander Barkov, because I still had him as a top 5 pick in his draft year, but I didn't really fully understand how special what he did was in the Finnish Liga. And there are tools now. You have different websites like Elite Prospects where you can look at historical context and you can compare them against players of similar size, age, abilities and style. And that helps you a lot in terms of building a more complete picture. So that's a huge element, I think, getting that historical context, but also not using it as a crutch to say, well, of course this guy is going to make it. William Eklund this year in this year's draft is one of the more exceptional U20 players or U18 or U19 players in Swedish hockey league history, in terms of points per game, the role that he plays at his age. But I have to see that, not just the numbers. I have to see what he does, and he's still an exceptional player. I think, potential top 5, top 6 pick in this draft. And, but yeah, I think those are the types of little things that you pick up along the way. And I think I've just become more in tune with different technical things. I think I'm a better evaluator of skating now than I was then. I think I look at it a lot more critically. I'm keeping eyes on, how defensemen keep their gaps and how they transition pucks and all those other things. I mean, you just start looking at the little nuances of the game the more that you do it. And the only way you can get there is with reps and just continuing to watch games. And I was really lucky to have tutors when I was at USA Hockey that, at the National Team Development Program, of people that were allowing me to watch video with them, were allowing me to go to games. And that gave me the foundation, but it didn't give me everything. And so I've had to pick up a lot of the rest along the way from the various scouts that I've met and the people that I've talked to. But it's the same as anything else. You only get better the more you do it. And so I think the reps are the real reason that I've been able to better contextualize players and still know that I will never know enough to be a perfect evaluator. It's just, and nobody will. So that's always something I keep in mind.
And I'm a huge proponent. I'll be very honest. I'm a huge proponent of moving the draft age back a year. I would keep 5 spots open for those elite Connor McDavids and other kids who are 18 who can jump right into the league, because we all know there's only 2 or 3 every year who come directly as pure 18-year-olds to the National Hockey League. And because the one thing I look at when I see a lot of players is, and I, like size, I think sometimes people, when they hear size, they just think of height or
Right.
weight. And to me, size is height and weight, but it's really strength. And then you can add in tenacity to it. But the strength component is a lot really in your DNA. And, there's people that are late physical developers that, their father or, their uncles and brothers didn't really fully develop until they're 20, 21, 22, where others are fully developed at 18. And I think is that the biggest challenge? Because when you project, because obviously scouting is a lot of projections, is one of the biggest challenging ones to project. Are they going to have the strength necessary to be successful in the NHL?
I think it's harder for somebody like me to judge that for sure. I think that teams have become much more in tune with getting the medical side involved, getting their strength and conditioning coaches involved. And that's why at the combine, I think one of the reasons that Elias Pettersson dropped to 5 was because there was a lot of intel that, hey, he's not going to tack on a lot of weight. He's not going to become a lot stronger. He's going to be injury prone based on his physical profile. So do we want to take that risk? And I think, some of that's been proven correct in that he's had injuries and he's been out at times. But at the same time, I think when he is healthy, he's an elite player. And so that's the risk reward that you kind of look at. But it is very difficult to project out on a lot of players. I'm trying to think of some that come to mind in terms of, I think RNH was obviously a guy that people are like, is he going to have the strength to do it? And I think he's one of those guys where he was just smart enough to adjust, and he did get stronger. You're not going to call him like the strongest guy ever, but he's in there and made it work for him and for his body type and everything else. And I think that's where I always value HockeySense so much more is because I think that, as we've seen with more players, like a guy who did develop strength but never developed explosiveness is Jason Robertson. Right now, he was always a bigger player, and a highly productive player, but his skating, that's the reason why he wasn't a first round draft pick. And it's also, why I think it took him a little bit longer to get to the NHL, because they had to figure out if he could do it. And then he just shows up and he's having a sensational rookie season. So those are the things that are very difficult to project. And I don't have the benefit of having, the doctors and the physiotherapists and everybody else looking at these players with their experience to make some of those more educated guesses. But at least that's something that teams have done much more lately.
So now, before we get to the 2021 prospect list, and I know your spring one just came out, and people can check that out at HockeySense. A guy who's been talked about a lot. There was lots of varying opinions on him when he was drafted. He lit it up in college this year, won the Hobey Baker, 3 points in his first AHL game. Cole Caufield gets recalled today by the Montreal Canadiens. Good chance maybe he makes his NHL debut tonight. There's a smaller guy, highly skilled. Chris, what was your draft analysis of Caufield, and is everything you saw kind of panning out, or is he potentially maybe going to be better than you thought?
I'm pretty sure. I don't know the specific number that I had him, but I believe I had him as a top 5, top 8, somewhere in there, in his draft year. I mean, he scored 72 goals his draft year. So you're like, whoa, okay, well, that's crazy. Nobody had ever come close to that number at the National Team Development Program as an under 18 player. And they have had Phil Kessel and Patrick Kane, who were playing against weaker competition at the time too. So I always believed that he was going to find a way, because he always has. Also, I thought last season he laid the foundation, but it was such a good decision to go back to Wisconsin to continue to get stronger. And one of the things that he really needed to do, and this is true in a year too, because he played with Jack Hughes, and so he wasn't the guy carrying the puck in the zone. He wasn't the guy driving play. He was the guy who was more was basically waiting for the pass. But the thing that always stood out to me is his offensive zone sense of timing, his net sense, shooting accurately, obviously an elite release. Not big, not a lot to support that he'll get tons stronger, but he's built a good amount of strength. He's improved his competitiveness away from the puck and does a really good job of getting in theirs. So he has continued to stack more skills on top of what he already had. But when you have an elite scoring tool like he does, it's a special tool. It's difficult to come by. So I also like to see him dominate college hockey this year. He was on my Baker watch list at the beginning of the season, and he's one of the betters in college hockey. And you just have to be patient with guys like that as they make the various steps. Of course, the AHL right away and scores. He's getting the net front. He's doing all the things he was doing in Wisconsin. So it helps that he's now in late form. And I think that's going to help Canadiens as well, is that he's ready to do it. And his ability to spot the space, to pop into an area where, he just gets lost in the offensive zone, even when keying on him. That's the thing that fascinates me, is he can just find a way to get open, and he can find a way to get a clean shot off. And when he does shoot, it's of course, and the goalie's going to have a hard time catching up to it. So I'm not surprised by his success. I think that this was headed. I wasn't surprised that he dropped in the draft, just because that was the nature of that draft class. And there were a lot of crazy things that happened over that class, but I still think that he is going to be one of the class. And I think he's going to help the Canadiens.
So now let's get to this year's draft. And, Owen Power, the big 6'6" defenseman out of Michigan, a lot of people have him right at the top or very near the top, Chris. But outside of maybe Drew Doughty, even elite guys like, Ekblad, Dahlin, other top D-men, it's taken them time to, even Victor Hedman, who's now arguably the best defenseman, he wasn't dominant right away. It's such a hard position. Should we expect Owen Power to come in, play well, but probably be more in the mold of like the Hedmans and the Ekblads rather than the instant Doughty success?
Yeah, I do think that there's probably a slow build to what Owen Power becomes at the NHL level, just because we saw it at points this season in college hockey where it took him a bit of time to adjust to the pace, to adjust to just the college hockey forecheck, which is, really difficult, and you got to be so sharp with your retrievals and everything. And he gradually improved as the season wore on. I think the big thing that helps him is he's really smart. He has a real feel for the game, a real sense of how to defend, how to play offensively, makes great passes. His mobility is terrific for a player of his size. I think he does need to get maybe a little bit more aggressive at times. Sometimes he can play it a little too safe. I'd like to see him get a little more physical. Those are things that he can improve on over time. But I think, the foundation of his skills are such that the upside's there for him to be a number one defenseman. And I think that that's really the big thing for me that keeps him in that conversation as being the top guy, because, in this draft class, you mentioned there's not a lot of super high end guys that we're completely convinced are going to be top players. I think there are a lot of maybe second line centers and second line wings and a lot of second pairing defensemen and things like that. But I think Owen Power has the upside and the profile, physical profile similar to Hedman. I think the playing style is closer to like a Heiskanen. He's kind of, it's just, he's very deliberate, but distinct and definitive in his decisions. And so I think that that's really a great thing to be at this point. And to watch him from when he started his freshman year, and really to have watched him from his rookie season in the USHL 2 years ago, to see the progression now, it's been very natural and gradual. I think that'll continue at the NHL level. He could play right away. It's going to take some patience to get him to a top level, but he's a guy that I think will make a difference for a team for years to come as a top pairing number one potential defenseman.
You mentioned, there's not McDavid's, and there are a few of those guys, or even like an Austin Matthews and such. Is there a potential David Pasternak who went 25th his draft year and is now one of the elite goal scorers? And, a lot of people look back in that draft and are like, how did Pasternak drop so low? Because he came in virtually right away. It wasn't like he was a guy who exploded at 21. It's hard to find those guys, Chris, but I'm sure every year as a scout, you're looking and you automatically just rank those guys higher. But is there a forward in here who you think, a late first round or mid first rounder who has the potential to turn out to be maybe the best offensive guy of the class?
Well, I think I think you could, that can happen in a lot of years. And I think in a year where there's really no consensus, it's even more likely to happen. And there is a mix of players here that I think are pretty special in terms of, they have one standout trait, or they have one thing that, they're among the best at what they do in the draft class. I think one of those guys might be Cole Sillinger, who's a bit on the, he's a bit on the smaller side. He played for Medicine Hat last year, moved to the USHL this year, and became a dominant goal scorer. He's got an elite release, tremendous hands. I think that sometimes you need to see a little more consistency in terms of his competitiveness and his pace. Those are the two kind of things that you're not sure about, but that shooting tool is elite. His hand skills are super high end. And he just has a know-how. And, obviously he's got NHL bloodlines, Mike Sillinger's son. And he's kind of really taken on his development this year. He's going to play at the World Under 18 Championship. Now, if he goes there and he blows that out of the water, it's going to be really difficult for him to slip, beyond the mid-range of the draft. For me, he's a top 15 pick. I think, that's not the general consensus at this point. I think it's all over the map on him. He's a little polarizing, I think, because of the size and skating. But he's a guy that I have a tremendous amount of respect for in this draft, just because of that hand skill and the shooting tool that he has. I mean, he scored some real highlight reel goals, just backing down defenders with smart moves and just making room for himself. And, I really like goal scorers that can create for themselves. And I think that's something that he does very well.
Now, but there, go
ahead. Sure. Yeah.
Matt Coronado, 46 goals in the USHL this year. I think that's a record for draft eligible guys.
It is. Yeah.
Is he the best pure goal scorer in the draft?
Ooh, that's tough to say. He's up there. I mean, the thing about him is he's like where Sillinger scores a lot of his goals from distance. Coronado scores a lot of his goals from in tight. He scores a lot off the rush. He's got a great shot. And to score 46 goals in the USHL is ridiculous. I mean, it really is. Thomas Vanek was the last guy to do it in his first draft eligible season. And so Coronado's right there with him and will surpass him, probably be the first 50 goal scorer in a draft eligible season, outside of the national team development program, since they don't play all their games in the USHL. But they've had guys like Caufield and Kiefer Bellows and others that have scored 50 there. But Coronado plays on a juggernaut team. He's playing with a great center in Sean Farrell, who is a Habs draft pick, who was supposed to be at Harvard this year, was supposed to be a freshman at Harvard. Harvard canceled their season, or the Ivy League canceled the season. And so he goes back to junior, and these two guys have just absolutely terrorized the USHL. I think for him, he reminds me more similarly of a more dominant Brock Besser in his USHL season, where he was strong, he was getting to the net, he was playing hard. Coronado is more of a driving forward. He's not big, but he's got power elements because he gets to the inside so well, and he lowers the shoulder, and he's difficult to slow down. So I don't know if he's the best pure goal scorer per se, but he's certainly in that mix of guys that you don't want to sleep on, because you're gonna miss out on a high-end offensive talent.
I want to ask you about scouting when there's a lot of really good players on one team. And is there a challenge at all? Because sometimes a guy might not put up as good a numbers because they're not playing with the skilled guys. And you look at Michigan now, Owen Power's a defenseman, but then you got Kent Johnson, right? You got Matthew Beniers. They're all on the same team, right? And they're a lot of these guys are all ranked in the top 10 on different guys' ranking boards. So is that an issue at all when you're evaluating Chris? Because you're like, well, these guys are just so good that they help elevate. Or is that a better way to say, that these guys can play with other elite players?
Yeah, I think you have to look at it both ways, and I think being able to play with an elite player is a skill. It is absolutely a skill. It takes hockey sense. It takes anticipation, because that other player has that. So you better be up to that level. And I think in the cases of specifically Beniers and Johnson, Kent Johnson spent most of the year playing. I believe he played with Thomas Bordeleau a bit in the beginning. He's played with Beniers as well. And you kind of see the separation. I do like seeing guys on the same team, because you can see kind of where others are. So Beniers started the year as the number 3 guy at Michigan, and there are some that would put him 1, and I have him 2 right now. So like basically for me, seeing Owen Power and Matty Beniers in the same team was like the year where it was Eric Johnson and Jonathan Taves, who were not on the same team, but were so highly regarded for similar reasons. And I'm like, wow, if you redid that, obviously you would take Taves first. You still got a very good NHL defenseman, a serviceable guy that was a number 1 overall pick, but you take Taves in that instance. And so that always playing in my head throughout the season. I think ultimately, Beniers is one of the best forwards in this draft. I think that he's a high-end offensive player, but he's also one of the best defensive centers that we have in this draft. He's one of the most competitive players, and the guy that you can win in the playoffs with, and reminds me so much of Jonathan Taves, who played his draft year at North Dakota, was basically developing in North Dakota after and had the tremendous World Juniors. Beniers was great at the World Juniors. Again, didn't have a Jonathan Taves moment per se, but nobody really does. I guess Troy Terry's the most recent one to do it. But yeah, but the way it's worked out for him is, I think that the more you watch players like that, and you see the skill of a Johnson, but then you see the total package of a player like Beniers, and you see it at the same game, you can just see that Matty Beniers impacts the game in a completely different way than Kent Johnson does, and one that may be more beneficial to a team that's competing for a playoff spot. And that's not to say that Johnson's not elite, because he's still a top 6 guy for me.
How much of a disadvantage, if any, do the CHL teams in Canada have this year, right? The OHL barely played. The Quebec League played for a bit, shut down. The Western League, some teams have played more games. Other teams have got shut down. So, you're talking, maybe 25 games, 28 potentially for a lot of these teams. Now, I know you watched these players last year, Chris, but man, these young guys can change so much from their 16-year-old season to their 17-year-old season. Does that make it a little bit more of a wild card for those leagues compared to NCAA and USHL, who are playing a lot closer to a normal season?
I think it does. It increases the risk a little bit because you're not necessarily sure. I mean, you take the WHL for instance, and you're say you're looking at the production of a Dylan Guenther who's a 2 point per game player. You say, well, that's pretty amazing for a draft eligible player, and it is. And I don't want to take anything away from what he's done because he's been exceptional this year and he's a top 5 prospect in this draft. But what happens is okay, well, he's playing against all the same teams all the time. They're playing within their divisions. They're not traveling the long distances that is the regular thing of the WHL season. So you know that context going in, but then you say, okay, well, let me see what he did last season. And how does he look compared to that this season? Where are the areas that he's improved? What are the things that he does better? Because you can still see those things. They're still playing real hockey games. It's a competitive thing. And so for me, I basically look at the production and I say, that's great. I'm going to put that aside. And I just want to see the foundation of skills that he's built up. And I think in the case of Guenther, you're seeing, improved skating, even definitely stronger, better timing, just becoming a more of a play driver while he's playing with veteran players. He played a lot with Jake Neighbors this year. And that's a guy that, went in the first round last year, and he's more of the driver of that line. So Guenther has to find a way to make an impact, but he was just popping in goals and assists all season long. So, but obviously the biggest concern at this point is the OHL players that have not played yet.
Mason McTavish.
Yeah, I mean, he at least went overseas and he went to the Swiss League, and that was great. But then you also have to say, well, how do I judge that? How do I judge the North American player playing in Europe who played about 15, 16 games or 17 games, I think, for McTavish? He looked great, by the way, over there. I mean, I was really impressed with how well he played. But then you say, what would he have looked like against his peers if he did that? And that's really what's tough to judge. And you can only go based on what you see. But then, there are other guys that will be playing on the Canadian U18 team. I think Logan Mailloux, who played for the London Knights, is a great example of a guy that I didn't list. And it's not because I don't think he can be a good prospect. I think he is. It's just I haven't seen him play this year. And there's too much I don't know yet that I will now wait and see at the under 18 Worlds if how much I can judge off of that one event. Now we hope there's going to be other things like prospect games. The NHL seems to be working on some of those things where they can pull the top players and give scouting events still. But even then, it's not the same. We just had the All-American Prospects game a couple of weeks ago, and it was a dreadful evaluation event. They had the NTDP playing against the USHL, the best American-born USHL players, and it was a no contest, and that was actually one of the better USHL teams that you could have put together. So it's you kind of have to take all of it with a grain of salt and just trust in what you saw from their U17 or their U17 season into their U18 season, or their draft -2, draft -1, whatever you want to call it, and just try to see how piece together what you can about what they're doing, what they've been doing, how they've, and if you see them live or on video, what have they done to improve, or what are the things that are different from the last time you saw them. But, you're taking it with a grain of salt again, because of the long layoff. There's nothing natural about the season. There are none of the natural benchmarks that we have, like the top prospects or the World Juniors. It's just a gradual progression of the season. That's the thing that's been most annoying to me is I can't plot out those points where, okay, here he is at the beginning of the season, here he is in the middle of the season, here he is at the end of the season. That doesn't exist this year. So you really have to be sharp and try to hone in on what you see.
Do you think the U18s are going to maybe be more influential than they ever have been in the eyes of scouts? Because here's an opportunity to see a lot of the best from different countries, and some kids who haven't even played very much. And I don't want to say it's a make or break, because it's a draft, and regardless of where you get drafted, it doesn't at the end of the day impact what you can do as an NHL player, but it can impact teams a lot. And I'm not going to say misses, but how that's going to influence it. I just get the sense from the U18s that it's going to carry more weight, maybe, Chris, than it ever has before. And even if you don't want it to, it just might have that recency bias potential more than ever.
It's not just the recency bias. It's going to be the first time that a lot of general managers have seen these players live, because we're expecting to see high level NHL executives and decision makers at this tournament. And they've been watching these guys on video. Some of them haven't been. And we know that, you can do all the scouting the whole year, but the general manager ultimately is the one that's going to sign off and make the decision. depending on how much he empowers his scouting staff. And so I think that's the peril of this event, is that, somebody performs really well, a general manager says one thing, and the area scouts that have seen him multiple times that have concerns here, that's where the potential for mistakes could be made. I think that everybody kind of goes into it knowing that. I think the smart scouting staffs are certainly not going to let that creep in to be the sole process of the decision. They're going to want to make sure they do all the extra homework. I think if a guy can really help his stock, no question, just because this is a big event. There's a lot of top end players here. It's a chance to see them right next to each other, playing against each other, playing with each other. It's such a great compare and contrast event anyway, but with the lack of views and the opportunity that so many of these teams are going to actually finally get to see a lot of the Europeans and the Canadians live that they haven't seen yet, if they couldn't cross the border, it looms largely. I mean, it's no question to me the most important scouting event of the season. It'll be the most, natural in terms of what we're used to, because it's a 2-week tournament and it's going to go the way it's going to go, and it's always the same. And so, that's going to feel a little bit more normal than anything else has this season.
And lastly, then we'll get to rapid fire. We always end our interviews with the rapid fire. But one of the more hotly contested debates every year in the scouting circles are goaltenders. And this year there's two: Sebastian Cossa, who plays for the Edmonton Oil Kings, and then of course you've got Jesper Wallstedt out of the SHL in Sweden. And a lot of people have those two as the top guys. I have seen a vast disparity of ranges on where they go. And goaltending, I find, is the one. It's funny, if you don't have a goalie in the NHL, you can't win. Like, it's really hard, but people are very nervous at times to want to draft them, because it seems that it's still maybe the hardest position to assess.
It is. I think teams have gotten better at it. I think that they've done more risk analysis in terms of actual, instead of scouting, in terms of what to do about a goaltender. But as we've seen in more recent years, teams are getting more comfortable with it, because I think the goaltending development in general has gotten better. Players are getting more coaching and better coaching at a younger age, and they're also getting opportunities at younger ages to play in big situation. That's why Jesper Wallstedt is such an intriguing prospect for this draft, because there isn't a ton of precedent for a player at his age playing as many games as he did in the SHL. That's an important thing there. But you watch him, and he's the other thing that I love about this goaltending crop, the two of them, is they are so different in the way that they play. Cossa is huge. He's 6'6", but he is one of the quickest 6'6" goalies I've seen. He's a little chaotic in the net at times, but even though he's chaotic, I still think he keeps his net pretty well for a goalie that moves as quickly as he does. And it's, he's real interesting. So I think it'd be really tough to draft either one of them in the top 10. I think that, if I was in the lottery range, I'd feel a little more comfortable with Wallstedt. And I think that he will probably end up, one of those two guys is going to go in the lottery range. I think there are teams that definitely have them in different orders.
Okay.
But I think it's possible. I guess it kind of depends on which teams, like in terms of prospect pools and what they have in their system already, are in the range where they can get those guys. But I do think both will be first round draft picks. I do think that both will be picked pretty early. And I think that they both have the upside to be number ones. And you're not picking guys in the first round if you don't think they can be a number one goalie. And I think both of them in this class, where they're kind of after them, it really drops off a fair amount. I think in the goaltending department, there are going to be teams that are eager to get one of those two guys and say, okay, we have our goalie of the future. Because I think that's what they can be. We've seen it now with Spencer Knight and Yaroslav Askarov last season. I think that these guys are very much, I don't think either of them are as good as Knight or Askarov were at the same age. I do think that they're both better than a lot of the other goalies that we've seen in recent years.
All right, Chris, we always like to end our interview with a segment called Rapid Fire. The only rule is you have to answer every question. Okay.
All right.
So we like to have a little fun. First one, after a tough night of scouting or a long night of scouting, what is your cocktail of choice?
Bourbon on the rocks.
Ooh,
yeah, a little bit
classy.
of water. Splash of water.
Okay.
Yeah.
For you, what's the toughest position to scout?
Goaltending.
Yeah.
Period. Yeah.
As a skater, is there a certain role type of player that's the hardest to project on what they're going to be as an NHLer?
Skater. Yeah, I think defensive defensemen are difficult to project. Like an actual pure defenseman, where you're just like, this guy is just a good defender. Because if he doesn't have other tools, it's really hard to make it in the NHL now. So that's difficult.
You've been at a lot of arenas over the years. So what is the best food at a hockey rink that you've been at?
Ooh, best food. Actually, this one goes out way back to 2011 in Krimitschau, Germany. Best bratwurst sausage in the history of any arena. The Ice Pirates of Krimitschau, which is like a second division German team, was at the U18 Worlds there, and one end of the arena is open, so it's all pine trees and in this and it's open, and it's like, and we were playing in April in this. I was working for USA Hockey at the time, but our equipment manager put down 6 of those brats in one day, which was the record. And I only managed 2 in a day, and I felt terrible the next day. And I didn't have a brat the rest of that summer, but they'd never compare to what we had there.
Okay. What is your bias as a scout that you always have to maybe hold in check? Is there a certain skill that you just are like, oh, geez, maybe I'm overrating it?
I think every scout that I would talk to would say he overrates every American player. So it's not even a skill. It's not even a skill. But I think I know, since I am American, I'm US based. I see a lot in the USHL and the NTDP. And I wouldn't say it's biased. It's just that's who I see the most. And
Okay.
so I have to be aware of that too. And I think I've gotten better at it. But I would say, basically, if there's an American on my list, sometimes it's very spot on, and sometimes there have been a few where I got a little overzealous and just believed myself a little too much because of a amount of views, and didn't give some other players the benefit of the doubt that I did for them.
Okay, good. That leads to my next question. So who is the player you scouted that you were like, man, this guy's going to be a star, and it just didn't pan out?
Mikhail Grigorenko was the number one guy. I thought he was going to be like Malkin level.
Oh,
Yeah, and this was early in my career too. I mean, like, this is when I didn't know much about anything, and I didn't really understand how physically dominant he was at 16 and 17 when I first saw him. I first saw him at the U17 Challenge, and it was just like no one could stop him. And then they saw him at the under 18 Worlds, and as no one could stop him. And he was playing on a line with Nikita Kucherov and Nail Yakupov, and Kucherov was the leading scorer in that tournament, and he still went in the second round that year.
crazy.
And,
Why?
so I mean, well, I think part of it was a lot of people didn't really know about him until the U18 Worlds, and then there was a lot of concern that, can we actually get this guy over here? Where Grigorenko was like, I'm coming to Quebec next year. We'll get, I'm out of here. All this other stuff. So they felt more comfortable with him, but I was convinced Grigorenko was such an elite playmaker. He did so many things that I didn't see teenagers do. There was always, the rumors that he wasn't as old as he said he was, or was older than he said he was. So, but that was the guy where I was just absolutely convinced. I think him and Jonathan Drouin is another one where I was just obsessed with the skill, and it got sucked into it, and thought he was, the next Patrick Kane.
Okay. So lastly, which player over the, you've been in this, entering your second decade now, that you scouted and that you liked, but you weren't sure on, and just, blew the doors off and become a much better player than you thought he'd be?
Ooh, man, there are a lot of those. I think you guys that you just learn about over time. I'm trying to think. Mark Scheifele, that's one for sure. So Mark Scheifele, I saw it, same World under 18s where I had all the bratwurst, and that's actually the same one where Grigorenko was at. I thought he was very good, but I didn't see, number one center. I didn't see, I didn't even see necessarily a lock to be a top 6 guy. A little concerned. I thought his skating was only okay at the time. And for whatever reason, I just didn't buy into him. And he's a guy that just became way better every time. And, it took him a little while to get to the level that he was at. And he had some bumps in his early NHL career. And I was like, see, I knew what I was talking about. And then all of a sudden, boom. And you're just like, okay, I was a complete idiot. But really, that's just the nature of development. You can never tell when a guy's, it's all going to come together for a guy. And if I would have known more about Scheifele, the person, I think I would have had a more And that's another thing that I've improved on as a scout, is trying to learn these guys as people as much as I can. And that's why I miss the combine, because that's when I get to do a lot of that. But, he's a guy that was so driven and so smart and so knowledgeable of what he needed to do to get to the next level. Guys that know themselves the way that Mark Scheifele knew himself at that point, those guys make it a lot more than they don't.
Chris, awesome stuff, man. I really appreciate this so much. Once again, people can get your stuff at HockeySense on Substack. Where can they go? What's the easiest way to get subscribed?
Yeah, so hockeysense.substack.com or chrispetershockey.com. Those are the two main avenues to get there. It's pretty easy. A paid subscription gets you pretty much everything on the website. So that's there's a lot of draft content, a lot of college hockey stuff as well. And then I also have a podcast that's kind of connected to that called Talking Hockey Sense, where it's a lot of the same things, but it's not just draft coverage. We try to be a little bit more general. So I'll have like a documentary filmmaker on next week and a draft Q&A in the same episode. So, you get a little bit of something for everybody. So, but I've had a blast, being independent again. It's how I started with my own blog, and I cannot be more thankful for the people that have signed up so far, because it's let me continue to do what I love. And I'm just really appreciative for all the subscribers that I have, and hope people will sign up after hearing this as well, and enjoy what they get out of it. But I really appreciate you having me on and giving me a chance to plug it.
Well, Chris, thanks so much, man. I love your stuff. I've been a fan, and really respect your analysis over the years. So I look forward to catching up with you again closer to the draft. As always, thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot, Jason. Really appreciate it.
There you go. That is Chris Peters. Check him out at HockeySense on Substack. And that wraps up episode 20 of the DFO Rundown. Frank will be back next week, and we're just securing. I'm pretty sure we'll have maybe one of the biggest wheelers and dealers of NHL GMs joining us on the show then. Have yourself a great weekend. We'll talk to you Monday.
Thanks for listening to the DFO Rundown with Saravalli and Gregor. Keep it locked on dailyfaceoff.com and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from to never miss an episode.